Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the National Museum of American History and our Innovative Lives program tonight, featuring Susan Kare. So I want to start and tell you a little bit about the Lemelson Center, who's your host tonight, and then a bit about the Innovative Lives series and tonight's program. So the Lemelson Center has as its core mission to engage, educate, and empower people for an era of rapid technological change. And so we do this in a number of ways. We engage people with our research, our scholarship, we study inventors, we collect archives of inventors with the long-range view that future biographies will be written about a more diverse pool, about women and minority inventors who were there in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, but who didn't necessarily leave archives, who didn't have the resources that today's biographers looking back draw on. So we need to make sure that that's there for the future. We empower people in a number of ways. We empower people through Spark Lab, our hands-on invention space for kids 6 to 12. We do it in our exhibits. So after this program, we'll encourage you to look at the Places of Invention exhibit and think about what made those tech clusters, those special places happen, and see that invention and innovation aren't just about technology. They're about new forms of creative expression. And they're about things like tonight's program, thinking about how the design of the world we inhabit actually shapes and structures how we think. And we empower people. And we want to empower people to be active participants in social and economic change. It's not about technology washing over us. It's not about us adapting ourselves to the technologies that come. It's about us using technology in interesting and useful ways to foster creative expression and to change the world. And so that's what we're about as a core mission. A couple housekeeping items. So first, we have some future programs I want to signal. Saturday, May 19th, so not this coming Saturday, but the one after, Military Invention Day will be a showcase of some 30 leading edge technologies as well as their historical antecedents. It's going to be around a whole host of communications, biological and other technologies, really leading edge and very interesting. On June 20th, we have our next Innovative Lives program, which is about the origins of esports. So you've perhaps heard about this, competitive video gaming. And we're going to have some of the people who pioneered that here for the program. We are recording tonight's program, so we ask you to silence your cell phones. And tonight really will proceed in three parts. So first, I'm about to introduce Susan Kare, who's going to give a presentation sharing some highlights from her career as a user interface designer. Then she and my colleague Eric Hintz will take the stage for a fireside chat. Eric is a historian here at the Lemelson Center, a student and scholar of independent inventors, and he curated the Silicon Valley section of Places of Invention, and through that got to know Susan Kare's work. And then finally, Susan will field questions. When you checked in, you should have gotten a 3x5 index card, and we encourage you to write out your question, and then I and some colleagues will gather those and bring them up to stage. If you didn't get one, find a scrap of paper and write out a question. So with that, let me introduce Susan Kare, a visual artist and user interface designer. Best known, of course, for designing distinctive icons, typefaces, and other graphic elements that gave the Apple Macintosh its characteristic and widely emulated look and feel. For nearly 30 years, she's been the principal of her own San Francisco-based design firm, where she developed user interface elements for many of the leading software, as well as bricks and mortar firms, including Microsoft, IBM, Facebook, and Target. You may have seen that icon. If you've clicked on an icon to save a file, switch the fonts in a document from Geneva to Monaco, or tapped your smartphone screen to launch a mobile app, you've benefited from her designs. In 2015, she joined the social bookmarking site Pinterest as a design lead and maintains a thriving commercial art business at careprints.com, where you can find signed prints of her most famous designs. She's received numerous accolades during her distinguished career. Just last month, she was named a medalist of the American Institute of Graphic Arts, which is essentially a Lifetime Achievement Award, although she's too young to be getting Lifetime Achievement Awards. We're grateful she can join us here tonight as part of our Innovative Lives series. Please join me in welcoming Susan Kare.
Hello, and thank you, Arthur, and thanks so much for coming tonight, whether you stayed after work or made the trip in. Really appreciate it, and I'm grateful to the museum for hosting me. I've worked for, as Arthur said, over 30 years doing user interface graphic design. I always say graphic design because user interfaces. I would never say I was a user interface designer because that's such a collaborative process. But here's a few images. Didn't design that van, but it was a Facebook gift. And I started working at Apple really in the end of 1982, and I feel as if I was so lucky to be in that milieu where the humanity of the project and the sense of warmth and friendliness was really pervasive. And since then, I've done a lot of icons for a lot of companies. These are some of the companies I've worked for, but do not worry, I'm only going to talk about a few of them briefly tonight. No fear. And I like to tell the story of how I got my job because I really didn't have any formal background in either computers or type design. Of course, it was in the olden days when you couldn't be a UI major. But I had worked at a science museum called the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, and I used a machine like this to generate labels for exhibits, a little bit like the ones here. It feels very familiar. That was not me. And in thinking about how could I apply for this job, which I heard about through a high school friend, Andy Hertzfeld, who worked early on in the Mac Software Group, I had some background in art history. Before my interview, I went to the library and I brought in under my arms books about type so that I would seem as if I knew what I was doing, which I really didn't. And Andy suggested that I get some graph paper, and sketch some images using the squares because that would be analogous to designing with pixels. So I did that, and oddly enough, some of them really inspired some later work that I did. So usually I preach, have confidence in your skill mix because you draw from different areas, and you don't necessarily, I always like to say, you don't have to have the exact right preparation for a job. And hold on to your stuff because some of those graph paper images ended up at MoMA, unfathomably. This is what it looked like when I got to Apple on the screen of a prototype Mac. So my job was to make this look better. And shortly got rid of Do It because it sounded a little R-rated, and it also looked like Dolt. So that became okay. And of course, it had a picture of a 5 1/4 floppy, which became a 3 1/2, and all the things that were in the round rect spelled out. The idea was to make those pictorial. So there were definitely some constraints, 72 dots per inch, black and white, but I didn't really think of that as problematic. It was just what the constraints were. So the first thing I did was Chicago, which was supposed to be, they wanted a bold system font, and I looked at some of the existing typefaces, and they looked all jaggedy and weird, and we had the wonderful advantage that all characters did not have to be monospaced, so we didn't have those skinny little M's and wide I's. And Chicago had a pretty good lifespan because it came back on the first iPod. We didn't even realize we were designing the iPod when we designed the calculator. But really what was explained to me is that your mom should be able to use it, not so politically correct, but at least they were including moms. Shouldn't have to, ideally, wouldn't need a manual, and that it should be friendly. And I still think about those things. So here were some of the icons I designed for that first Macintosh. I know that the Happy Mac, which they just said it's going to take a while to load, we should have something on the screen. So it seemed as if it would be nice if it smiled at you, and I had loved these buttons from when I was in the 7th grade. Later, I read this book by Scott McCloud. I think it's a wonderful book. It came out in early 90s. It's not explicitly about user interface, but it's a wonderful book to think about user interface issues. And Scott McCloud says, he kind of explains, I thought, about the Happy Mac by saying that when you take all the detail away, everyone can see themselves in those simple things, or he shows the less detail, the more universal. So I think sometimes now with millions of colors and much higher resolution, there's a tendency to say, here's your nationality of policewoman. And sometimes I think, but then you have to make a very specific image of everybody, which is really hard, sometimes it makes more sense to me to have something very generic that can stand for more people. And this icon, I was told, would never be seen by anyone because it was for catastrophic system failure. And so I thought I would never have picked something so irreverent if I had known, unfortunately, how frequently it would make an appearance. But that's what 1.0 is. You just get a few more errors, perhaps, than you think. It really was meant to be more evocative of Saturday morning cartoons than anything menacing. So this is a subway station in Sweden, and kind of bears a little likeness to something I did for MoMA a little bit earlier, but kind of nice to have stuff picked up. When I got to Apple, I really did not work on paper, but we printed out images on paper. I worked on always designed on the screen, but we would print out, when I first got there, the hex representation, and then I could key that in so that it would be in the software. Shortly thereafter, Andy Hertzfeld rewrote things, so it made this obsolete, but I kept a few of these printouts. This was really what it was like to work on that Mac screen. You would see simultaneously small and large in this pre-Photoshop era. And sometimes I did little portraits of people just because it was fun. And we would always try out different title bars. You can see we ultimately decided to use the horizontal ones, but it was always advantageous to just mock different things up to give it a chance and get some opinions. So lots of iteration. I thought, applications could seem active with a hand like verbs, and there could be a companion noun of a document. And it seemed as if that would hold up just fine, because how many applications could there be? In a similar way, there were 256 slots for fonts, different fonts, and we maybe used a dozen of them. And again, it just seemed as if that would last forever, which didn't at all. It's just kind of funny how your perspective changes, but I'm glad that there are lots of fonts in the world. I thought, Hourglass, who uses that? Let's get a little more modern. And I only include this because it's sort of a principle of icon making, that this printer looks a bit like the ImageWriter printer that shipped with the Mac, which used paper that fit on sprockets and had a big knob that you to get the paper to attach. So I realized if I had just made it simpler, it could have had a much longer lifetime. So usually I think don't draw icon, think about the principle, not about the thing, because the thing will always change. This is what the Mac menus looked like in 1983. And then Steve used to come through the Mac group at the end of the day, and he's like, that's our logo. You can't take our logo for granted, get rid of that. So it was a command key. So I thought about what 10 Commandments, what could that be? And I had a lot of books about symbols, which I was happy to flip through for inspiration. And I came across this, and in the index, it said that that was a symbol for interesting features at Swedish campgrounds. So I thought, well, sometimes it was called the feature key. It's like easy to draw in 16 pixels and kind of like a clover leaf. So I saw it for the first time when I visited Sweden a few years ago, and I was like, oh my God, the command key is everywhere. But usually I would say it's much better not to make an abstract symbol and force people to learn what that is. It's better to have it have some root in meaning. And not too many years ago, but this worked fine, and it's had a long lifespan. But someone from Sweden sent me a picture of this Borgholm Castle, which is probably the derivation of that symbol, that it was supposed to be a castle with turrets seen from above. So I was kind of happy in long retrospect to see that it wasn't completely abstract. And I got to do things like the control panel, tried not to use any words so that it could have use as the Mac spread around the world. I like to think we sort of had our stab at emoji pretty early on. And because I was a sole practitioner, probably the person at one point in time that had a lot of experience using the Mac, I got to do the art for most of the brochures and some of the materials that shipped with the Mac. The image on this Mac Paint screen came from a print that Steve Jobs brought in and Bill Atkinson scanned with a rudimentary early scanner. You can kind of see on the flowers are a little bit abstract. And so I took that kind of messy scan and I cleaned it up, and I thought it was such a fun image in black and white that it ended up getting a pretty good lifespan to represent Mac Paint. And those were some of the tools. Kind of happy. This was, even today, I guess I need to update this slide, but a lot of these tools maybe are drawn with higher resolution, but they're still pretty basic. Icon design, if you ever study art history, you know nothing's very new under the sun, so people have definitely been communicating with small pictures, and I love that cartoon, and definitely making typefaces out of little blocks and telling stories with pictures. None of this is really new. This was actually in an issue of Smithsonian that in France, there's a 38,000-year-old icon, which I liked. And definitely some of embroidery arts and our exact analogs to bitmap design. This was probably my first pixel creation when it was still okay for kids to make ashtrays. Shows like that. But really, I always think in the work that I do, part is craft, part is just trying to think like what is a good, meaningful connection between what you can draw and the idea. So this was really quick. I needed to do on a watch for Swatch something that meant alarm. So I started out with a clock and some noise and maybe more noise, maybe make it look more like an alarm clock because that was what it was, or noise on that, and then that seemed like, too complicated. So I went back, kind of tried the same thing a different way, maybe a travel alarm, maybe draw it differently. And then it's like, maybe it shouldn't be a clock after all, because that would be a clock on a clock. So what else could mean alarm? Maybe, I like all, maybe the alpha alarm clock. I draw it different ways. Or something just noisy. Moral of the story being, not an exact science. I always try to have a variety of solutions and live with them and ask people and see what holds up. After I worked at Apple, I worked for Microsoft on Windows 3.0. It was so amazing to have some colors, even if some of them were bad, just to be able to use that to differentiate things. I got to do the cards for solitaire, which was one of the most fun projects because I am addicted to solitaire. I usually had to take it off the machine, not to spend too much time playing that. And I feel proudly that it had a good run for procrastination before social media provided so many other options. And a company called AreaWare makes physical cards of that solitaire deck, which seemed kind of fun. And this is just to show that you have these constraints of these 16 VGA colors, but if you dither them, you can get a really different look that isn't quite so garish. So I feel as if I did not work on clip art, but that was a product that came out when Mac came out, with images that could be cut out and used in your newsletters. And then 10 years later, I worked for a company that was a collaboration among Sony and Apple and Motorola, and we made this handheld communicator, maybe a little before the iPhone, a little before its time, but we had rubber stamps to put on postcards that you could send in kind of an emoji-like way. Then I worked for 4 years at Facebook on virtual gifts before you could just upload your own art in Facebook. And every day for almost 4 years, we would release one new gift. And they sold for $1. And I learned a lot about what people would pay $1 for in 64 by 64. And I would say sometimes I tried to make things that I thought were more artful. But really, I would say if you really need $1 from someone, draw a penguin. We had limited editions, and we did a lot of penguins, hearts, teddy bears, and that was the all-time bestseller. And people bought these. Ultimately, Facebook let third parties take over that kind of activity. And I've still done different kinds of stickers because it tends to be illustrative and kind of fun, and it's fun to have a project where I could go back to bitmap style. So that was for a company called Path. But whether it's vector or bitmap, I always talk about the problem, provide a range of solutions, talk with the client, iterate till you get it right. And I just am showing these. This was for a logo for a company called Curbside that had to do with driving to a store and picking up your stuff. So I did all kinds of different things, and it's, thank you Photoshop, easy to mock things up. And that's what they really chose. That's not a mock-up. And now I can see that I was destined to work at Pinterest. Pinterest helps, this is what Pinterest says, but it's true, helps people discover and save, and ultimately, if they want to, do some of the things they love. And I work on icons for the product, among other projects. I'm working on a kind of a graphical language for Pinterest also. And Paul Rand has always been inspiring to me, and I always look back at his books when I need inspiration. And try really hard to give something a little bit of meaning in hopes that it will be memorable. And sometimes it's been a little gratifying. I didn't do this, but it's street art. People make icons their tattoos, which is flattering. I love to paint murals. This was in Sweden. And sometimes it's fun to take that same bitmap technique and make other things. And thanks so much.
I don't know if you guys can hear me. There we go. Thank you, Kima. It's really hard to follow that presentation. That was amazing. Thank
Anything
you.
left to talk about?
Thank you so much, Susan.
welcome.
And thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Eric Hintz. I'm a historian here with the Lemelson Center, and I study the history of invention. I had the real pleasure and privilege. I hope you guys will get a chance when things break up here to walk around and see the Places of Invention exhibition. We're proud of it. There's a section in there on Silicon Valley, and as we were working on that, I got to learn about Susan, and I was kind of joking with her today that I feel like I've been stalking you for 2 or 3 years, and it's really a thrill to meet you. And we have a really cool workup on her stuff in there, and you can even, there's an interactive where you can play around and design your own icon in the 8-bit style. So I encourage you guys to go check that out. So that's kind of how I ended up being the guy that gets to interview Susan Kare this evening. And so we thank Susan, we thank all of you for being here. So, we'll talk for a few minutes, and then we'll take some of your questions. So why don't we just get started?
And thank you. I'm really grateful to be part of that exhibit. I toured it. It's such a fun exhibit that has so many other avenues of invention. I appreciate the inclusion.
Very good. Well, I figured you gave us such a great tour of your career, a highlights tour of your career, but I'm sort of curious about you and your life and how you kind of came to be inspired to be an artist. And so, just start from the beginning. Where did you grow up, and what was it like growing up?
Well, got a few hours now.
Yeah, exactly.
I was born in Ithaca, New York, and shortly thereafter moved to Raleigh, North Carolina. And I guess to answer your question, I just was one of those kids that always loved art and feel grateful to my mom especially I just gravitated toward all those kinds of projects where you make things. And I think my mother had polio when I was born in one leg, so she wasn't she couldn't do athletic things, so we did a lot of projects, and that probably helped me get off on toward the art side of things.
Terrific. And you showed us the ashtray, right? So lots of crafts. This is good.
Lots of crafts.
Yeah, so you're putting things together, and we know that from studying inventors, this is an important thing, right? The physical, the haptic, and probably with artists too. So besides things like ashtrays, what were some of the things that you loved, different media that you liked working with, and as a kid thinking about art?
I painted and did things with beads and, typical things that kids do, but I think I was always the one to volunteer to make the poster or that kind of, anything that involved any kind of art material.
Now, did you have any particular mentors? I mean, you talked about your mom for sure, but did you have folks when you were growing up that really kind of encouraged or helped cultivate this in you, this love of art?
Well, I think thanks to all art teachers, but also when I worked at the Franklin Institute, that art department was run by a designer named Harry Laux, and he had gone to Art Center in California and worked in Charles Eames' design office. Okay. So I think I was the lucky recipient of some of those graphic design principles. That was working at the Franklin Institute was my introduction to type and formal graphic design.
So eventually you moved from Raleigh to Philadelphia area. That's where the Franklin Institute is. Yeah, sorry. I want to make sure
My dad was a professor, so he worked at NC State, and then he worked at Penn.
Penn, terrific. So you know, from Harrison High School, right? You got to meet Andy Hertzfeld. I mean, were you guys? I mean, I love that story of how that connection comes back around when you're in the Bay Area. I mean, were you guys buddies? How did you hang out in high school?
I think somehow a number of people with whom I'd gone to high school in suburban Philadelphia ended up in the San Francisco Bay Area. So we were just friends, so we kept in touch, and there was probably a little bit bigger circle of friends. So Andy just knew that I liked art, so he had asked if I could just do a few sketches because he needed something to put up on the screen of the Mac. And I went to his house in Palo Alto and I saw kind of, I think, not even in a case, but a Mac screen. And I was the farthest thing from a computer buff, but I thought the graphical quality of it was really nice, and I was game to. He said that if I would help him, he could get me an Apple II. So
Okay.
I thought, great. And I did learn to use paint programs on the Apple II,
Yeah.
but that also made me appreciate how much easier it was to have. It was an easier user interface on the Mac.
Right, and I want to return to that moment in the early 1980s when you sort of reconnect with Andy and you get hired to the Apple Macintosh team. But between that, you go to college, you go to grad school. So tell us a little bit about your education and how that's kind of informed your work.
You know, I went to liberal arts undergrad, and I went to NYU for grad school in art history, thinking that I might like to teach. And when I got out of grad school, I moved to San Francisco and worked for a museum. And a friend expressed it that I was on the wrong side of the creative equation because as part of that curatorial job, I would go to artist studios to see if we could borrow work. And every time I went to some artist studio, I just wanted to stay and not be the curator, but be the artist.
Yeah.
So Andy helped me by ultimately it worked out so that I was able to leave the museum and work at Apple and be more of a designer than
Okay.
a curator.
Yeah. So that Art Jones was really never left you. I mean, you were doing visual art, you were sculpting and things like that at the time.
Yes, but I also feel grateful for formal education and books I read and art history classes. I don't at all mean that wasn't, I mean, everything brings you to where you are.
Sure.
I feel as if some understanding of art history has always been helpful in terms of where to look for inspiration, which is everywhere.
Right. Yeah, so that deep training definitely helped you in that interview, right? So you mentioned the fact that, you know, Andy calls you up, he says, hey, we've got this art job. He kind of showed you the prototype Mac.
Right. But then I had to go interview with the head of Mac software, and because I knew nothing about software, I felt really insecure. And but I was excited to work, and in retrospect, I think it was great to be the art person in the software group because I could learn how everything was put together. I could learn so much, and so many of the people that I worked with in that software group at Apple, I just thought were so intelligent and creative and had terrific ideas for icons. Maybe they weren't going to draw them, but I mean, really, in every job I've done, I've always wanted to see the placeholders that engineers make, because a lot of times there's great concepts and you can use those.
Yeah,
Just
don't have to start from zero, start from
Right.
2 or 3 or
Right.
wherever they are.
It's a springboard.
Terrific. Now, I think it's probably important to remember, because we live in, you know, the 21st century, and, you know, every time you pull up your iPhone or a laptop, we see the results of this work that you helped inspire. But in 1982, what did a computer look like, right? I mean, yeah, tell us about like why the Mac was so revolutionary, and maybe tell us a little bit about what the sort of prior status quo was prior to the Mac.
Well, so many things to say. One, I feel as if I had a wonderful opportunity, but the whole standing on shoulders of other people and so many good designers between the first Mac and your phone. Lots of people's work, not just not me. And I mean, I think the thing about the Mac, there obviously was the Apple II. But it had color graphics, but it did have a command line interface. So you had to type, and you had to, I think, be a little bit more computer savvy to remember certain commands. I mean, the Apple II was a phenomenal seller for Apple, and many kids and all kinds of people could use it. It wasn't like a mainframe, but the goal of the Mac was, I mean, the ad slogan was "the computer for the rest of us," with that idea that before now there were a great number of people that wouldn't have thought they could use a computer, and now things are going to be different.
Sure. And your comment about
And I was one of those people.
Well, so that was kind of where I was going with this question, which was, you had all this deep training in art. You have a PhD in art, and you've studied different media. You'd studied, the hieroglyphics, the mosaics, different forms of art, and all of these things informed your work, but you had not been a software person. So, and you said that was intimidating in a way, but in some ways it's an advantage, right? Because you're, in some ways, the customer that they're trying to sell to, right? So did you find that the fact that you had not come up through the software side or the engineering side of computing was helpful to you?
Well, probably for this particular project, where the idea was to communicate to everyone, that you're right, that probably was an advantage that I thought, well, if I get it, then probably other people would get it. And it was also an environment where things were not driven so much at that point by metrics. It was a little bit more, I don't know, heart-driven. And it's not that I wouldn't show things to lots of people, but I think there was some intuition behind some of the decisions that were made about what icons to use, as opposed to a lot of data. And that was probably a good match for me.
You had a strong intuition about what would work.
I think it's great to have data and all kinds of information, but it was probably a little more informal.
Sure.
That process.
Now, this was a high-powered team, right? It's Andy Hertzfeld, Bud Tribble, Joanna Hoffman, Bill Atkinson, Burrell Smith, and of course, Steve Jobs. And a certain mythology has sort of emerged around that team. There's movies and books and stuff. But I'm curious, what are your memories of working on that team? And what did it feel like? I mean, it must have been pretty heady stuff to work on that team.
Well, you can look at things in retrospect. Honestly, there were 100 people on the Mac team, and it's kind of going to work. It wasn't as if, it's like everybody, you go to work now, and maybe in 20 years, people can say, oh, what was it like? It's not that it's not a good question, it's just, at the time, it seemed like a great job, but that was my job. So. And I was friends with, I had a lot of respect for a lot of people on that team. And, but it definitely, there were HR, probably could reel off a lot of those 100 people. And, but I do remember it as being, Steve would say sometimes, we're going to remember these days. These were really good days. But it was a little bit of, okay, what do we need to get done by tomorrow?
Excellent. So, you know, what's incredible to me as I was researching this period of your career was that much of this icon and typeface work for the Macintosh happened over the course of one incredibly intense year. If I have the dates right, you kind of got hired about late 1982, December or something like that, and then it launches in January of 84, so it's 12, 13 months. So that's pretty wild.
Well, probably it was a place where it wasn't a very Monday through Friday 9 to 5 type of environment. And it was probably a year where I and a lot of my colleagues probably came to work almost every day. But maybe that's a good thing about low resolution,
Yeah.
fewer decisions. But things kind of feel as if it was, I love to think we got a lot done, but very iterative and a lot of dedicated people who cared about it, so that made you want to work harder to keep up with everybody else. Like Bill Atkinson,
Sure.
I think who wrote Mac Paint, just a super gifted programmer. He liked the idea that within Mac Paint there would be different fonts, and he definitely encouraged me and inspired me to make a lot of things for that app.
Terrific. You can still keep up with any of those guys?
I pretty much keep in touch with a lot of people from that time. We're still friends.
Terrific. Terrific. So after...
He mostly spends his time on photography now, though,
Excellent.
not programming. But you can still tell he has a programmer's sensibility because he loves photography, but he's maniacal about printing techniques and the technical side of photography as well as the creative side.
Fantastic. So after Apple, you stayed at Apple for a little while after the Mac launched, and then you went to Next, and you got to work with one of your heroes. You mentioned Paul Rand. So tell us about how you got to work with Paul Rand and what that was like working with one of your design heroes.
That was a wonderful time. I was the 10th employee at Next, so we needed a logo, and I thought that would be a wonderful person with whom we could work on the logo. Steve insisted that we have kind of a bake-off and hire 4 people to each submit work, and then we would choose our logo from among that. And I would say categorically that's not a good way to get the best creative. I think it's better to make a decision and then really work with someone to help you. But we did do that, and ultimately ended up getting this wonderful presentation from Paul, which was a book that went through the thought process for the Next logo, and I think he enjoyed working with the group. It was a new, obviously he'd done lots of work for IBM, so working with computers wasn't so much of a leap, but I still draw on a lot of things he said. I notice in his books he tends to use the same colors and pairs of colors over and over, so I always look at those. And he said, you don't need a lot of typefaces, you just need to know how to use them well. So I notice he uses Univers and Garamond, and he practices what he preaches.
Some restraint, it sounds like. Excellent. So in 1988, 1989, you make a big leap. You kind of leave the corporate world and you start your own firm, Susan Kare LLP. And you've been doing that, you did that for 30 years. So, what drove you to become an entrepreneur?
Probably multiple reasons. It was first and foremost the opportunity to get to work on a great variety of projects. I loved that. And I loved having my own studio. Sometimes I would collaborate with different people. And but I think it almost without exception, I've been really lucky to have great experiences with a group of clients. Some people I would do one project, some people I would do work over time.
So you, if I remember correctly, you worked from your home, or did you have a studio? What was the sort of arrangement? I'm sort of curious, like, as you're developing, cooking up all this great stuff, what it looks like in your room.
I did have a studio that I worked out of.
Yeah, so what does that space look like? The artist's workshop, the atelier.
It's probably why I like Pinterest so much now, because I always like to have wall space and have all kinds of things pinned up for inspiration, lots of books.
Well, where else do you go for inspiration? Do you ever get outside? Do you take trips? I mean, I know you talked a lot about how you go through books, and you found the Swedish the marker, which is great. I mean, what are some other sources of inspiration for you?
Oh, I mean, it's even hard to say. I think I've always thought that folk art and old advertising, probably everything at the Smithsonian.
Yeah, could be.
All kinds of physical design, I think, is inspiring to me, and art and humble art and things in nature. I love the beach, and in my office I do have a lot of shells and mobiles and that kind of thing. But in terms of like inspiration for icons, I just try and think hard about the concept, and looking at other things is often just a springboard to coming around to some idea. It helps to look at visual material.
Now, over the years, you've kept your operation pretty small. I know you have a couple of assistants, but you're pretty much a one-woman design shop, and seems like you've resisted the urge to sort of grow into a big design firm or anything like that. And so I was just sort of curious, what's motivated you to sort of just keep it small and keep it a one-woman show?
Well, I think I definitely have collaborators when it makes sense for a project, or it's more work than I can do with my hands. And sometimes collaboration is wonderful because it's fun to talk about design problems. But I think I generally resisted the desire to build a larger business, because then I would be selling and managing all the time. And I so much like doing design work myself.
Terrific. I think we got about 5 minutes left. We're going to try to wrap up at about 7:30, so consider this a warning. I don't know if you guys have your note cards handy, or if we could start thinking about collecting those. I'll ask Susan a few more questions, and if Dan and Amanda can come down the aisles and collect your questions if you have some note cards. So I'll ask a couple more, and then we'll pick up those. Let's see here. Your art business. So in addition to, doing the design for the software companies or even the bricks and mortar companies and your work at Pinterest, you are a commercial artist. You have a thriving art business. So tell us about your art business.
I mean, I think that started because we got some requests for, kind of like happened organically, to make some icon prints. So in fulfilling that request, we ended up setting up a website to make icon prints of different, maybe not every single icon, but a lot of Apple icons and some others. So it's kind of a nice outlet to keep doing design work that's meant for the wall and not the screen.
Yeah. Excellent. And if you're interested, right, you can go to Susan's site, careprints.com, and she'll put together the icon for you and even sign it, right, and mail it off to you.
We do. I do sign them and I look at everyone, but it's a collaborative business.
Terrific. Terrific. I should also mention Susan has a book. It's called Icons, and it's you put it together, and it goes through a lot of the different designs that she showed you tonight for a lot of her different clients. So check that out if you're interested.
It's a quick read.
It's very visual. It's beautiful.
A lot of pictures.
So maybe last question before I take the note cards and start asking your questions. I know I'm a writer, so I'm often writing papers or doing things like this or trying to figure out things, and sometimes you get stuck. And this is a common thing, writer's block or artist's block or whatever you want to call it. Like when Susan Kare gets stuck, maybe that never happens. What do you do to get unstuck? What do you do
like,
to sort of...
Thank you, Internet, because I don't know. I mean, there are definitely, right now, I'm trying to think of I'm trying to do an icon at Pinterest for exact match. And I don't know, it's like, if you, you want the exact same thing that you see in a picture. So what's the symbol for that can fit in 20 by 20? So I'm not quite sure what to do with that. So sometimes I just, it's helpful to look at other images.
Terrific. Okay, I'm going to ask one more of my own, and then we'll get to some of these, and that'll give, while you're answering, that'll give me a chance to thumb through a few of these.
Thank you.
So, I mean, I think we got a really great flavor of this because you were so kind to put together your presentation. But, what would you say are the distinguishing characteristics of a Susan Kare design? Or maybe asked another way, how would you describe your own work? Sorry.
I mean, I usually, I think, I'm just trying to think how not to be too repetitive, but I try to get to the heart of the meaning of something and not have things be too complicated. Like I think good icons don't tell a story. It's more of a symbol.
Okay.
So not three little pictures when one will do. So I hope I have some economy of expression, maybe a little teaspoon of humor.
So the humor is so interesting. I mean, there's so much whimsy with all the things that you do. I mean, I know that there were design specs for, especially thinking about the Macintosh, but I mean, this must come from somewhere too. Did you have like a streak when you were a kid as like a practical joker, or were you,
I mean, I don't think so much jokes, but I think, yeah, I like things like smile face buttons and troll dolls and some of the things that probably fall more into the friendly category than horror genre. But mostly, seriously, I think you're trying to communicate with a wide audience on a subject, at least with computing, that historically was a bit intimidating. So I still think to overgeneralize a lot of software is complicated, and people throw that word easy around so much, and yet some things don't seem easy at all to me, or a little hard to remember. It's not that, I mean, everybody's managing to use their phone, so, but I think it's always good to look hard at things and see how design might make the task a little easier. And sometimes something approachable might help.
Terrific. Well, thank you for chatting with me, and I wanted to give our audience a chance to ask a few of their questions, and we've got some good ones here. Start off with maybe an easy one here. Susan, when you're at work drafting an email or a memo, what font or typeface do you use?
I mean, honestly, I wouldn't say I have a signature typeface, but and often I just use clean defaults like Arial and Helvetica, because I don't want, you want to use something that the recipient will have. So sometimes that lowest common denominator, but when I design things, I probably really don't deviate that much from what I learned from Paul Rand.
Excellent. Similar sort of question. Favorite Mac icon? Question mark. Is that like favorite child? I mean, maybe that's too hard, right?
You know, I feel good about the Smiling Mac,
Yeah.
and I like the watch.
What was the second
The
one?
watch.
The watch, yes. Terrific. God, so many
But
good
really,
questions here.
it's not so much, it's more like that was a job I was so happy to have. So I really feel more gratitude that people responded to those than so much like, do I like it or not?
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely has a longevity, right? We still love all the stuff that you did 30 years
Makes
ago.
me
It's really
feel
cool.
happy.
Looking back on your life and career, what gives you the most satisfaction? Any regrets?
Well, I feel great satisfaction that I was able to keep working all this time, more or less as an artist, and make a living. So I felt like the fact that that was possible, hooray.
You didn't starve.
No, didn't starve, so I feel grateful for that, and kind of feel grateful because I would have thought that what I wanted to do was be an artist and paint or make sculpture, and I actually found so much pleasure in these design problems and getting to work with people on all kinds of different projects. Loved that. And regrets. I mean, I don't think full of regret. I don't love the X, the lowercase x in Chicago. Wish I could have done a better job with that.
Gosh, Susan, really? That X? Come on, like.
Kind of bugs me, but I don't.
Okay, I guess I'll have to accept the lowercase x. Okay. Susan, what activities and causes are you really passionate about?
Well, I actually love the ocean. I'm an enthusiastic, if not gifted surfer. So I have been historically involved with a charity that's called Surfers Healing that takes autistic kids surfing.
Oh, fantastic.
And I'm pretty dedicated to that. And I like Surfrider to keep beaches clean.
Okay. Terrific. You live
So-
pretty close to the beach there in San Francisco, right?
You know, I mean, there are many wonderful organizations that I care about, but those two are really close to my heart.
Terrific. Susan, what principles, advice, and wisdom have really influenced and guided your life and career?
Well, it's funny, I'm putting together, I've only given it once, a talk called Good Advice, and I feel as if that good advice comes from all kinds of sources, you know. I have some from my grandparents and my parents, and some from Paul Rand, and some from Steve Jobs, some of the people we've already touched on. It's funny, when I gave the talk, there's an architect I work with, and he's a designer and an architect, and after I gave this talk, I said, well, if any of you have any other pieces of good advice, I'd really appreciate it. And he said that he worked in London with a great number of architects, and everybody would always be talking about all these ideas they had for what they wanted to do. And he said that, but one guy there said, well, at the end of the day, do the drawing. You know, if you don't just talk about it, but you actually get it, do the drawing. and then you're like on the way toward doing something. I thought that was a pretty good piece of advice.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't want to take the time to go through all these individual pieces, but my dad said something that sounds a little depressing, but it's probably really realistic. And he said, you can change your situation and have different problems, but you'll always have the same number of problems. Which I think about sometimes because it's sort of like it helps you focus on trying, it's like, no, oh, I'll change my job or I'll move or I'll do something else and then everything will be great. No, it's like you'll just have different problems. So I thought it was kind of a realistic piece of advice that I think about it, even though it doesn't sound cheery.
Yeah. My dad has a variation on that one. He says, sometimes the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, but that's because there's more manure. So, you know, you trade one set of problems for the other. There were several questions in here about sort of aspiring artists, aspiring designers, you know, aspiring entrepreneurs, young people, you know, so what advice or charge would you give to those folks trying to break into a design career or trying to make it as an artist? Just a general sort of question about your advice or charge to folks.
Well, sometimes I think two things. One, if, you know, there's no absolute value, there's no exact path, but I know that one thing that I did was anytime that I could do a poster or graphics or illustration or even now, work for that just needs doing, that's maybe for a good cause, but it builds up your portfolio and gives you more experience. I think that's a really good thing to do, to just get experience and have more work to show. And I also, just from observation, think that if there's a place that you'd like to work or a design group you'd like to be in, but maybe there's a job at that company that isn't the exact job that you want, I think it's good to join the place you want to be because it's a lot easier to move around once you're on the inside.
That's great advice. Last question here, and then I'll have a few housekeeping announcements before you don't want to stand too long between the people and the food and the drink. So,
No.
And I'll use my prerogative.
That would be good advice.
That would be good advice. Yeah, don't stand between people and beer. Looking ahead, you know, what do you still want to achieve? What's on your bucket list? What's next for you?
Oh, I'd love to paint a giant icon on a multi-story building somewhere because you'd get that feeling of up close and seeing it from a distance. And, you know, it's always fun to do projects you haven't done before. And I think that's part of, I'm enjoying working at Pinterest. I love to, I'm doing some fabric for some furniture.
Oh, cool.
I think that'll be fun.
Yeah.
Just a little bit the novelty of projects and media that you haven't worked in before. So I don't know exactly what's around the bend, and I never, you know, that's one thing about when I had my business, I'd say like, I love doing this, but you definitely don't know what you're going to be doing in 6 months or a year. So still feel a little bit like that.
That's good. Well, I wanted to thank the audience for your questions, your great questions, and please join me in thanking Susan Kare.
Thanks. You're welcome.
So yeah, that was really fantastic. And I just have a couple quick announcements in closing here. So first off, we're going to break up now. We encourage you to come see some really special historical artifacts that have come out of the archives and our storage. So our curators, Peggy Kidwell, Drew Robarge, and Allison Oswald, have materials related to some of the tech firms that Susan worked with, including Apple, Next, IBM, and Facebook, as well as some of the really industrial precursors when we think about typography including metal type and other materials from the Mergenthaler Linotype Company, which was a leading manufacturer of typesetting equipment going far back up to the mid-20th century. We also invite you to see the award-winning Places of Invention exhibition, which is over here. And over there is also some food and drink. Please keep the food and drink away from the historical artifacts. We like to bring them out every 50 to 100 years, and it's important we be able to do that again. And last, tonight's evening program is really kind of an extension of the Places of Invention exhibition, and so we're really grateful to the donors and financial supporters, including the Wallace Coulter Foundation. And so with that, let me thank two of my colleagues especially, Amanda Veracruz and Dan Holm, and please join me in thanking our wonderful speaker and Eric.